My name is Cornelius Grant. I'm a songwriter, musician, producer, conductor, and all-around good guy. I started my life in music at around 9 years old when my grandmother, in her infinite wisdom, bought me a guitar because I wanted to play piano. And she said, well, son, I can't afford a piano. So I was looking through the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and I saw this guitar for like $13. I was like, So I brought the catalog to my grandmother. I said, listen, can you buy me this? And she immediately filled out the invoice for mailing and ordered the guitar right away. And so I got the guitar, and immediately, we had been to a holiness church, and the guitar player in the holiness church, he was playing while they were singing, and the Holy Rollers, And so I was impressed with that. So I was like, this guy really plays. So as it turns out, he lived, when we moved to Fairfield, he lived down the street from where our house was. So I went to him and I told him, I said, listen, I want to learn to play guitar like you. So he tuned my guitar, but he tuned it in what they call vestibule. It was like tuned like a chord. And so I started to play with these 3 fingers. I still keep this fingernail to this day. People tease me about this fingernail, but it means something for me. So I started playing with these 3 fingers. And so I didn't play chords, I was just playing solo stuff. And I played like that for about 2 years. And I had a cousin who was in the service who played guitar. And he came home, and so they told him, hey, your cousin, he's playing guitar. So we went and sat down, and he said, okay, let's see what you do. So I was playing guitar, with my 3 fingers. He said, okay, can you play any chords? And I said, chords? He said, yeah, chords. He said, let me see how your guitar is tuned. So he took my guitar, and he said, it's not even tuned correctly, so you can't even play chords. And I was like, oh. So he tuned it, and then he showed me 3 chords, these country and western, doom, 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 And he said, oh, okay. I said, wow. So then I had to learn to play all over again, with the guitar tuned that way. And so from that, he told me, he said, like, you can get a guitar book, and that way you can learn chords, with the guitar tuned this way. So I bought a book, I think it was a Mel Bay book, and so I started to play chords. So around that time, I was around 13, and then we relocated to Detroit. And so when I arrived at Detroit, I started playing, and I realized I needed an electric guitar. So my uncle took me to a pawn shop and bought me an electric guitar and a little amplifier. And so I started to play, I started to practice. And one day, and this is a spiritual kind of thing, I was looking in the telephone book and I saw an address. It was on the east side of Detroit. I lived in the northwest side of Detroit. And a voice said, get on the bus and go to this address. And I got on the bus, rode the bus to the street, got off, and I was walking down the street. carrying my guitar. And I heard these guys playing. And I went up and I knocked on the door. And they said, hey, I said, I hear some guys playing, music in the back. They said, yeah, they're in the back. Come on in. You have a guitar, huh? I said, yeah. I went in the back, and these guys were sitting around. It was like a garage kind of thing. And so they were playing. And so they said, oh, you a guitar player? I said, well, I play a little bit. Guy says, okay. The guitar player says, you can plug in my amp. So, plugged into his amp. He said, what do you want to play? I said, well, I play a lot of blues. He said, okay, let's play some blues. So they said, what key? I said, you just started, I'll catch you. So they started to play. And so, like musicians will do, they each would take turns taking a solo. So it got around to me taking a solo, and they pointed to me, and I started to play. When I finished playing, they stopped. And the guy says, how old are you? And I said, well, I'm 14. He said, where'd you learn to play like that? And I said, I just, been playing at home, right? The guy says, well, listen, we got a gig like next week, and we'd like for you to come and play with us. You have a telephone? I said, yeah, I have a telephone. So I gave him my telephone number. So the next week, they called me, and I went, and it was like a cabaret kind of thing. And I played, with the band. And after that, word kind of got around about this kid on the northwest side of Detroit that could play, And as word got around, I started to get calls from people, like, for example, at the Rage Show Bar, there was a guy named Roosevelt Fountain and the Pins of Rhythm. And they were playing at the Rage Show Bar. Now, there was a guy who was very popular, and he would play guitar, but he would get calls for other gigs. So when he would get calls for other gigs, they'd want someone to come and substitute, right? So this is one of those times when he got called on another gig, and so they called me to come and play. So this was the first time I was playing in an actual nightclub. So I was playing at the Rage Show Bar, and I remember people like Marv Johnson came in, and so on that gig I learned a lot about show business, because there was a guy named Andre Williams who had a record I called Bacon Fat, and he was like the MC. So that kind of established my knowledge of the stage, because I watched him, and MC and that kind of a thing. There was also a group called the Royal Jokers who performed, and they were something like the Coasters, because they did comedy during their act. Okay, so at one of the cabaret gigs, a guy, after the set, he approached me. He said, listen, I like the way you play. I want you to play on my record. So I said, okay. So, he took my number. In the meantime, I joined a band called Joe Williams and the Staccatos. Now, this band was very, this band stands out in my mind because the band leader, the trumpet player, who was also an arranger. And so he insisted that me and the bass player learn to read chords. I knew chords, but I didn't know how to read from a chord sheet. So he insisted that we learn to read chords. And so from that, we learned to play standards like Autumn Leaves and stuff like that, right? Now, the reason this band sticks out in my mind is because in this band, we had a drummer who was an epileptic and a saxophone player who was an alcoholic. And so it was playing under stress every night because some nights the drummer would have what we call a fit in the middle of the set. And so we had to, stop and deal with that. And the saxophone player who was an alcoholic, sometimes he would be too inebriated to make the gig. So when he would be too drunk to make the gig, the bandleader would call a substitute saxophone player. One of the substitute saxophone players was a guy named Henry Crosby. So Hank Crosby would come and substitute. And at the time, he was working at what was to become Motown. It was Whitfield. And so I remember between sets, once he was writing an arrangement in pencil, and on the top of the arrangement it said, hitchhike. And I read the top of the arrangement, I said, hitchhike, and I started to laugh. He said, oh man, this is gonna be a hit record. Which later Hitchhike became Marvin Gaye's hit. Anyway, so this band, I finally, it's a long story, but anyway, I left this band and I was at home and Hank Crosby called me one morning and he said, listen, what are you doing? I said, nothing. He said, well, Mary Wells' guitar player is about to be inducted into the Army. You're good enough to get that gig, so you go down and audition. So I grabbed my guitar, went to Hitchfield, and auditioned for Benny Benjamin, a famous drummer. And I got the gig with Mary Wells. And so that was the start of my career. So I would come out and I would do a song with the band, and then the backup singers would come on and they would do a set, and then Mary Wells would come on. So I was with Mary Wells about a year. And during that time, the Temptations, who hadn't had a hit record, was doing backup for Mary Wells. We did a show in Brooklyn, and Barry sent the Temptations out to not only sing backup, but to do an opening spot on her show. So they didn't have a guitar player. So anyway, so to make a long story short, I played their show. When I finished, Paul called me in the dressing room and he said, listen, man, when we get a hit record, I don't care where you are or what you're doing, you're coming with us. So we just did a high five and didn't think much more of it because, I was working. They were still doing hand claps and background at the studio. So then I left Mary Wells and I went with Marvin Gaye. I was Marvin Gaye's first guitar player. So doing my stint with Marvin Gaye, the second gig, he called me in the dressing room and he said, listen, Corn, I need a guitar player and a conductor. I can't pay both. So you're it. To which I was totally ticked off because I was like, I didn't sign up for this. So fortunately, we went back to Detroit after that gig, and I thought about it because I thought about quitting. Because, at that time, I was playing, in between playing with Mary Wells, I would go out with all the other acts. I was playing with the Marvelettes, I was playing with Martha and the Vandellas, I played with Kim Weston, played, all of them. So I was thinking, maybe I would just quit this and just go with one of the acts. So something said, no. So I went to Cornelius and I bought a book on conducting. And I stayed up all night learning how to beat and cut off a band. So the next morning I was a conductor. And that's why when the Temptations got their hit record and they called me, my duties were to conduct and play guitar. And it was a result of Marvin Gaye. I think the first gig with the Temptations was at the Apollo Theater because Eldridge Bryant was still in the group and we were in the station wagon on our way to New York. And the station wagon, those days the last seat faced the opposite, faced backwards. And so Eldridge Bryant and myself were in that seat. And so we were en route to New York and Eldridge started to drink. And he said, hey, I don't really need this. I got a job in a dairy. They called me to do this. He said, I don't really need this. And I was thinking, gee, this is an ideal group and ideal gig. So, he said, hey, I don't really need this. So we did that gig and after that, I guess there must have been a while before they had another gig of that, on that level. So during that time is when Eldridge was dismissed from the group and they took on David Ruffin. The group was made up of David Ruffin, who sang lead and some first tenor, Paul Williams, who sang baritone and lead, Melvin Franklin, who sang bass, Eddie Kendricks, who sang lead and first tenor and second tenor, Otis Williams, who sang second tenor, sometimes first tenor. A group like that made up of strong personalities. There were conflicts, but the conflicts didn't become major until later on. Most of the conflicts that we had were really playful conflicts, like Paul and Eddie would fight, but they grew up in Alabama together, so we would kind of stay out of it. They would fight until we maybe pull them apart. There were conflicts between myself and Melvin. We would tussle, and we had a tussling match one day, and we bit each other. And we bit each other severely. We drew blood. I had a scar on my shoulder for a long time. And so, but it was like what they call cabin fever. When you're together long periods of time in one room constantly. So sometimes those things, came up. The major conflicts that affected the group came later on when David became impressed with the fact that there was a Diana Ross in the Supremes, so he felt the need for it to be David Ruffin and the Temptations. So that was like the major conflict that kind of broke the group up. David Ruffin was a producer's dream, a producer and songwriter's dream, because you could give David a lyric sheet and play the track, and he would lay a track that you couldn't come up with as a songwriter, you see? So he was massive a lot at that. He had had experience before getting with the Temps. He had a couple of hit records out. A producer by the name of local Billy Davis, who had managed and produced David prior to him joining the group. And he had a mediocre hit called Action Speaks Louder Than Words. And the record was so popular that when he got with the group, because we didn't have enough songs to make a complete show, we had him also to do that record as part of the act. Action Speaks Louder Than Words. So he was phenomenal. I used to join in with doing the choreography, and I came up with this idea that when Paul would do a lead and David would take over, Paul would sing up to the part where David would take over, and he would just throw the mic up in the air, and David would come and catch the mic and continue singing. And we did it once, you know, but we figured it was a little too complicated, you know. But it was a good idea. Him falling on his knees, and that came about from when he was doing his record. You know, he did this fall on the knees and a whole bit. So when he started doing Losing You and those kind of things on the TV shows, that became part of the choreography. Look, I Know I'm Losing You was co-written by myself and Norman Whitfield and Eddie Holland. Losing You came about because I was in one of the rehearsal rooms with the bass player, and I was playing fifths. And he said, yeah, those are fifths. Us bass player call those double stops. And I said, double stops. And I was playing bloom, bloom. And I kept playing it, and I said, I like the sound of that. I like the sound of that. And so I started playing da-da-da-dum, bloom, bloom, da-da-da-dum, bloom. And while I was playing that, Norman Whitfield walked by, and he stopped, and he came and he said, play what you played again. I said, you mean this? Da-da-da-dum, bloom, bloom. He said, yeah. He said, put some chords to that. And I said, chords? Okay, well, George Clinton, who later became Funkadelic, he was in a doo-wop group. And they had a record I called I Just Want to Testify. And I liked the chord format of that song. So it was doom, 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 doom. So I said, okay. So I played those range of chords. And Whitfield said, yeah. He said, I want to cut this. And I thought, okay. You know, so the next week, he set up a recording session, and we laid the track to I Know I'm Losing You. And the track was so different, and that introduction was so different, until people were talking around the studio and said, like, wow, that's a hot track. So the song became I Don't Want to Lose You. and we titled it "I Don't Want to Lose You." But then there was another song called "I Don't Want to Lose You." So Eddie Holland was in the studio, and they were playing the track, and Eddie Holland says, "Wait a minute, I got it." So they played the track again, and he said, "Your love is fading. I can hear your love fading. It's fading away from me." And so the song became "I Know I'm Losing You." But so that song still around. Well, the first run with the Temptations, I was with them about 12 years straight. I was from 1964 until around 70, 75. And I left in 75. And about around the end of 78, 79, they asked me to come back. So I came back and I stayed up until 1982, which was just before the reunion tour. Everybody thinks life on the road is like all a piece of cake. You know, it's all fabulous, but it's pretty grueling. The traveling, and I went all over the world and only saw the airport, the hotel, and the venue that we played. And so it wasn't until I left the Temps that I really saw traveling and enjoyed traveling to other cities and countries. Because we were young and we were enjoying what we were doing, it didn't seem to tax us as much. Now I don't think I could do it. The Temptations and I traveled to South Africa around 1979, I think. I was doing apartheid. And it was a very exciting trip for us. And we noticed that everybody talked about, you know, the separation of the audiences and that kind of thing. But we noticed during our engagements, the audience were totally integrated. And we were staying in a 5-star hotel. And the 5-star hotel that we were staying in, it seemed to have been integrated also. So we left there, and a few years later, I was explaining to someone that I went to South Africa and explaining how I was doing apartheid, but doing our gigs, they were totally integrated. So they said, "Oh, you guys were honorary whites." And I said, "No, I don't think so." They said, "Check your passport." I went and checked my passport, and sure enough, that was why we were honorary whites. That's why we didn't have the normal problems and the normal, integration problems at our gigs and whatnot. The crowd response was tremendous, you know. It was great, you know, and we were happy because, like I said, we were, the theaters that we played, when they opened the theater, often, you know, like the Africans would make their way to the front, you know. It was like playing musical chairs. They'd be in the front. And so we were saying, "Hey, what's the problem? You know, there's no bias here." But it was because we were honorary whites. During our trip to South Africa, we went to Johannesburg and visited Soweto and Durban and Cape Town. And I fell in love with Cape Town. I always said if the political things changed, I would probably move there, because Cape Town headed all over Hawaii. So that's why I had always figured maybe I would move there someday. I felt a very kinship with the Africans. As a matter of fact, they are so spiritual and in tune. When we arrived in Johannesburg, they gave us all African names. And they named me Alani, which means peacemaker. And I don't know how they drew from that, but you know, they speak closer, and they gave me a closer name. And the other guys, they had just regular African names, but they gave me a closer name, and Alani, and it meant peacemaker, which I never figured how they surmised that in the group I was kind of like the peacemaker, you know, in the group, you know. When I left the Temptations for the final time, I formed a company called the Siege Company. And through the Siege Company was a kind of a multimedia type company, which under the banner, we produced videos and things like that. One of the projects we did under the Siege Company was a project on an opera singer by the name of Camira, who sang opera in a modern kind of way. And she did a project with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. And her husband, who financed her project, financed the sessions, and for the video, he had a black glass-bottom boat built for her video. But anyway, we filmed her in the middle of the Champs-Élysées. What stood out was the makeup that she wore, which was like a bird kind of makeup. And that was quite an experience.